On May 29th, 1914, a passenger liner carrying over 1,400 people disappeared beneath the frigid waters of the St. Lawrence River in just 14 minutes. 1,012 passengers and crew drowned that morning, making it one of the deadliest maritime disasters in history. The death toll was higher than the Lusitania. It rivaled the scale of the Titanic tragedy that had shocked the world just 2 years earlier. If you love deep dive documentaries, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss an episode. And yet, if you ask most people today about the worst shipwrecks in history, they will never mention the Empress of Ireland. The ship, the victims, and the horror of that morning have been almost completely erased from public memory. This is the story of how over 1,000 people died in one of the fastest maritime disasters ever recorded, and why almost nobody remembers it happened. The Empress of Ireland was not some neglected cargo vessel or forgotten steamship. This was a luxury ocean liner operated by Canadian Pacific Railway, one of the most respected shipping companies of the era. The ship was nearly 600 feet long, could carry over 1,500 passengers and crew, and was considered one of the finest vessels crossing the Atlantic. When she departed from Quebec City on May 28, 1914, she was carrying immigrants heading to new lives in Canada, wealthy first-class passengers returning from European vacations, members of the Salvation Army traveling to a conference in London, and crew members who had made this crossing dozens of times before. Nobody on board had any reason to believe this voyage would be different from the hundreds of successful crossings the Empress had completed since her maiden voyage in 1906. The ship had an excellent safety record. The crew was experienced and professional. The weather forecast was favorable. And yet, within 24 hours of leaving port, the Empress of Ireland would be resting on the bottom of the St. Lawrence River, and more than 1,000 people would be dead. What makes this disaster particularly haunting is not just the death toll, but the speed at which it happened. When the Titanic struck the iceberg, passengers and crew had nearly 3 hours to react, to launch lifeboats, to say goodbyes, to make desperate decisions about survival. The Empress of Ireland sank in 14 minutes. 14 minutes from the moment of collision to the moment the ship disappeared completely beneath the surface. Most passengers never made it out of their cabins. Many drowned in their beds, trapped below decks as the ship rolled onto its side and flooded with shocking speed. This is not a story about negligence or obviously preventable mistakes. This is a story about how everything can go catastrophically wrong in a matter of minutes, how a routine voyage can turn into a mass casualty event faster than anyone can react, and how a tragedy of this magnitude can somehow be forgotten by history, while lesser disasters remain burned into cultural memory. The Empress of Ireland represented something powerful to the people who boarded her that spring morning in 1914. For many passengers, this ship was literally carrying them toward new lives. Canada was in the midst of a massive immigration boom. The government was actively recruiting settlers to populate the western provinces, and shipping companies like Canadian Pacific were making fortunes transporting hopeful immigrants across the Atlantic. The Empress of Ireland made regular runs between Quebec City and Liverpool, and each voyage brought hundreds of people chasing the promise of land, opportunity, and a fresh start in the New World. The ship herself was built to embody that optimism. Launched in 1906 from a Scottish shipyard, the Empress of Ireland was designed to compete directly with the great Atlantic liners of the era. She had three classes of accommodation, with the first class sections featuring mahogany paneling, ornate dining saloons, and luxurious staterooms that rivaled the finest hotels. The second and third class sections were more modest but still comfortable by the standards of the time. Canadian Pacific wanted this ship to represent the modern, prosperous Canada they were selling to potential immigrants. On this particular voyage, the passenger manifest told the story of early 20th century Canada in miniature. There were wealthy businessmen and their families returning from European tours. There were middle-class families emigrating from Britain with everything they owned packed into steamer trunks. There were single men heading to Western Canada to work on the railways or claim homestead land. And there were 170 members of the Salvation Army traveling as a group to attend their organization's international Congress in London. The Salvation Army members had boarded the ship in high spirits, singing hymns on the dock as they prepared to depart. Many of them were bringing their children along for what was meant to be the trip of a lifetime. The crew of the Empress of Ireland was led by Captain Henry Kendall, a well-respected officer with years of experience commanding Atlantic vessels. Kendall had actually achieved minor fame 2 years earlier when he recognized the infamous fugitive Dr. Hawley Crippen aboard one of his ships and alerted authorities via wireless telegraph, leading to Crippen's arrest for murder. Kendall was known as a cautious, competent captain who followed proper procedures and ran a tight ship. Under his command, the Empress had completed 96 round trip crossings of the Atlantic without serious incident. The ship departed Quebec City on the afternoon of May 28th, 1914, and began the journey down the St. Lawrence River toward the open Atlantic. The first portion of any Atlantic crossing involved navigating the relatively narrow waters of the river before reaching the Gulf of St. Lawrence and then the open ocean. This was considered the most navigationally challenging part of the voyage, but it was also routine. Ships made this passage constantly, and the Empress had done it nearly 200 times before. As night fell on May 28th, the ship continued downriver under clear skies. Passengers settled into their cabins, attended the evening meal in the dining saloons, or gathered in the public rooms to socialize. Parents put children to bed. The Salvation Army members held an evening prayer service. Crew members went about their duties with the practiced efficiency of experienced sailors. Everything was proceeding exactly as it should. The Empress of Ireland was on schedule, on course, and operating normally in every respect. Nobody on board had any way of knowing that in just a few hours, most of them would be dead. At around 1:30 in the morning on May 29th, the Empress of Ireland was approaching Father Point, a location where ships would typically drop off their river pilots before continuing into the open Gulf of St. Lawrence. The night was clear and calm. Visibility was excellent. Captain Kendall was on the bridge, as he typically was during navigationally challenging portions of the voyage. The ship was proceeding at normal speed down the center of the shipping channel. At approximately the same time, a Norwegian coal ship called the Storstad was heading upriver, traveling in the opposite direction toward Montreal. The Storstad was much smaller than the Empress, displacing only about 6,000 tons compared to the Empress's 14,000 tons, but she had a reinforced bow designed for breaking through ice in northern waters. This reinforced bow would prove catastrophic in the collision to come. Both ships were aware of each other's presence. In the clear. Night. Their navigation lights were clearly visible from miles away. According to proper maritime procedure, the ships should have passed each other port side to port side, which means they would pass with each ship keeping to its own right side of the channel, leaving plenty of room between them. Both captains acknowledged seeing the other vessel and appeared to be taking appropriate action to ensure a safe passing. Then, suddenly and inexplicably, fog rolled in. The St. Lawrence River is notorious for rapid fog formation, particularly in the spring when warm air moves over the still cold water. Within minutes, visibility dropped from miles to nearly zero. Both ships immediately took the required action under maritime law and brought their engines to a stop. When vessels encounter each other in fog, the protocol is clear. Stop your engines, sound your foghorn, and wait for the fog to clear before proceeding. Both the Empress of Ireland and the Storstad followed this procedure. What happened next remains disputed to this day, and the conflicting testimony from survivors on both ships has never been fully reconciled. According to Captain Kendall of the Empress, his ship remained stopped with engines in neutral while the fog persisted. He stated that he could hear the Storstad's foghorn and could tell from the sound that the Norwegian ship was moving and changing position. He claimed that he sounded his own foghorn repeatedly to signal his stationary position. Then, as the fog briefly lifted, he saw to his horror that the Storstad was heading directly toward the Empress's starboard side at an angle. He immediately ordered his engines full astern in a desperate attempt to avoid the collision, but there was not enough time. The captain and crew of the Storstad told a completely different story. They maintained that after stopping in the fog, they saw the Empress's lights and believed the larger ship was continuing to move, fearing that the Empress might cross. Their path, they made the decision to restart their engines and maneuver to avoid what they perceived as a moving target. They claimed that the Empress suddenly appeared out of the fog directly in front of them, and despite throwing their engines into full reverse, they could not stop in time. At 1:55 in the morning, the reinforced bow of the Storstad struck the Empress of Ireland on her starboard side, penetrating deep into the hull. The impact occurred in one of the worst possible locations, rupturing the hull in the area of the boiler rooms and the lower passenger decks. The collision tore a massive hole in the Empress's side, opening the ship directly to the river. Water began pouring in immediately with overwhelming force. For a brief moment after the impact, the two ships remained locked together, with the Storstad's bow wedged into the Empress's side. If they had stayed connected, the Storstad might have acted like a plug, potentially slowing the flooding long enough for a more organized evacuation, but the current and the movement of the ships caused them to separate. The Storstad pulled her bow free from the wound she had created, and the hole in the Empress's side was now fully open to the river. Thousands of tons of water began flooding into the ship every minute. Captain Kendall immediately grasped the desperate nature of the situation. He knew the ship was mortally wounded. He ordered the watertight doors closed, but many of them had already been forced open by the pressure of the incoming water. He attempted to turn the ship toward shore in hopes of beaching her in shallow water, but the Empress was already listing so severely to starboard that the steering was becoming unresponsive. The ship was going down, and going down fast. To help this story reach more people, please like, share, and subscribe with notifications turned on. What followed was not the relatively orderly disaster that characterized the Titanic's sinking. There was no time for orderly evacuation, no time for the band to play while lifeboats were loaded, no time for the dramatic goodbyes and heroic sacrifices that became part of the Titanic mythology. The Empress of Ireland sank so quickly and listed so severely that organized rescue became nearly impossible almost immediately. Within minutes of the collision, the ship had rolled so far onto her starboard side that the port lifeboats, which should have been accessible to passengers on that side of the ship, were hanging uselessly in the air, too high above the deck to be reached or lowered. The starboard lifeboats, which were now on the low side of the tilting ship, were submerged or useless because of the extreme angle. Of the ship's 40 lifeboats, only a handful could even be launched, and those that did make it into the water were often swamped or capsized in the chaos. For passengers below decks, the situation was nightmarish beyond description. Most people were asleep in their cabins. When the collision occurred, the impact woke them suddenly, and within seconds they were plunged into darkness as the ship's electrical system failed. In the pitch black, passengers found themselves in cabins that were rapidly tilting at impossible angles. Doors that had been vertical were now nearly horizontal. Floors had become walls, and water was rising with terrifying speed. Many passengers who might have survived if they could reach the deck found themselves trapped. The passageways designed for passengers to walk through had become tilted chutes filled with rushing water, falling furniture, and panicking people. Passengers clawed their way upward toward where they thought the deck should be, only to find doors jammed shut by the angle of the ship or blocked by debris. The darkness was absolute. The sound of rushing water, breaking wood, and screaming filled every space. For those who did make it to the deck, the situation was barely better. The ship was tilting at such an extreme angle that walking was nearly impossible. Passengers clung to railings, to each other, to anything they could grab as the deck continued to roll beneath them. Some made the decision to jump into the river, plunging into water that was only a few degrees above freezing. Others clung to the ship, hoping somehow that she might stabilize, that rescue might come, that this nightmare might somehow resolve itself. The Salvation Army members, who had been traveling as a group, suffered catastrophic losses. Many of them were berthed in the same section of the ship, and when that section flooded, entire families were trapped together. Parents made desperate attempts to save their children, pushing them toward any opening, any possible escape route. Some succeeded, most did not. 133 of the 170 Salvation Army members on board died in the sinking. Multiple families were entirely wiped out. Parents, children, and grandchildren all drowned. Together as the ship went down, the crew of the Empress did what they could, but they were fighting against impossible circumstances. Crew members who tried to launch lifeboats found the boats jammed or submerged. Those who tried to help passengers to the deck found the passageways blocked and flooding. Some crew members made heroic efforts, diving back into flooded sections to pull out trapped passengers, only to be caught themselves when the ship made its final plunge. Other crew members, faced with the reality that the ship was going down in minutes, made the decision to save themselves and jumped into the river. Captain Kendall remained on the bridge as the ship sank beneath him. When the water reached the bridge, he was forced to swim clear of the sinking vessel. He survived the disaster, one of the few senior officers who did, and his survival would later raise questions about whether he could have done more or whether his decisions contributed to the catastrophic loss of life. 14 minutes after the collision, the Empress of Ireland disappeared beneath the surface of the St. Lawrence River. The ship rolled completely onto her side, then slipped beneath the dark water with a final surge of bubbles and debris. Hundreds of people went down with her, trapped in cabins, pinned by debris, or pulled under by the suction of the sinking ship. Those who had made it into the water faced a different horror. The river was so cold that survival time was measured in minutes. Hypothermia set in rapidly. People who were strong swimmers found their muscles seizing in the cold. Many simply gave up and slipped beneath the surface. The Storstad, whose collision had caused the disaster, remained afloat and immediately began rescue operations. Her crew launched boats and pulled survivors from the water as quickly as they could. Other ships in the area, alerted by distress signals, rushed to the scene and joined the rescue effort. But they were collecting survivors from a Massive maritime disaster where most victims had never even made it off the sinking ship. The rescue boats found people clinging to debris, to overturned lifeboats, to pieces of wreckage. They found bodies floating face down in the water. They found children who had been dead in the water for so long that there was no hope of resuscitation. And they found far too few survivors. When the sun rose on May 29th, 1914, the full scale of the disaster became clear. The Empress of Ireland was gone, resting on the bottom of the river in just 130 feet of water. Of the 1,477 passengers and crew on board, only 465 survived. 1,012 people died in those 14 minutes, making it one of the deadliest maritime disasters in history and the worst maritime disaster in Canadian history. The immediate aftermath of the Empress of Ireland disaster was chaotic and heartbreaking. Survivors were brought to shore at Rimouski, a small town that was completely overwhelmed by the sudden arrival of hundreds of traumatized, injured, and freezing people who had just watched their loved ones die. The local hospital was quickly filled beyond capacity. Churches, schools, and private homes were open to house survivors. Doctors and nurses worked around the clock treating hypothermia, injuries from the collision and sinking, and the psychological trauma that came with surviving such a catastrophe. The bodies of victims began washing ashore along the riverbank in the days following the sinking. Some were recovered from the wreck itself by divers who descended to the Empress's final resting place. Others were never found, remaining entombed in the ship or lost to the river. The identification of victims was complicated by the fact that many had drowned while still in their nightclothes, with no identification documents on them. Families who had been traveling together were often identified only when surviving family members could describe what their lost loved ones had been wearing or carrying. The city of Quebec established a temporary morgue in a large warehouse to process the hundreds of bodies. Coffins were brought in by the trainload. Families who had lost loved ones traveled to Quebec to identify the dead and arrange for burial or transport of bodies back to hometowns. The Salvation Army, which had lost so many members, organized mass funerals for their dead. Photographs from these funerals show rows and rows of coffins, many of them small boxes containing the bodies of children. As the immediate crisis began to resolve and survivors started to recover, attention turned to determining what had happened and who was responsible. The Canadian government immediately launched an official inquiry into the disaster. The inquiry was tasked with determining the cause of the collision, evaluating whether proper maritime procedures had been followed, and assigning responsibility for the loss of life. The inquiry heard testimony from Captain Kendall of the Empress, from the captain and officers of the Storstad, from surviving crew members and passengers, and from maritime experts. The testimony revealed deep contradictions about what had happened in those final minutes before the collision. Captain Kendall maintained that the Empress had been stationary when the Storstad struck her, and that the collision was entirely the fault of the Norwegian ship for moving in the fog. The officers of the Storstad insisted that they had seen the Empress moving and had been attempting to avoid what they believed was a moving vessel when the collision occurred. The inquiry ultimately concluded that the Storstad was primarily at fault for the disaster. The official finding was that the Storstad had violated maritime law by moving in the fog, and that her actions had directly caused the collision. The Norwegian owners of the Storstad were held financially liable for the disaster. However, the inquiry also noted that the rapid sinking of the Empress was exacerbated by factors related to the ship's design and the failure of her watertight compartments to contain the flooding effectively. The financial and legal aftermath of the disaster dragged on for years. Canadian Pacific, the owner of the Empress, filed massive claims against the Storstad's owners. The Storstad herself was eventually seized by Canadian authorities and sold to help pay damages. Insurance companies fought over liability. Families of victims filed wrongful death lawsuits. The legal battles continued well into the 1920s, long after public attention had moved on to other events. But even as the legal process ground forward, something strange was happening to the disaster itself in public memory. The Empress of Ireland was being forgotten. Within months of the sinking, coverage in newspapers had dropped dramatically. Within a few years, the disaster was rarely mentioned except in maritime history circles. By the middle of the 20th century, most Canadians had never even heard of the Empress of Ireland, despite the fact that it remained the deadliest maritime disaster in their country's history. The Empress of Ireland disaster killed more people than many famous shipwrecks that remain well known today. The death toll was higher than the Lusitania, which was sunk by a German U-boat a year later and became one of the key events leading to American entry into World War I. It was comparable in scale to the Titanic, which occurred just 2 years earlier and remains probably the most famous shipwreck in history. And yet, if you ask people to name famous maritime disasters, almost nobody mentions the Empress of Ireland. The forgetting of the Empress was not accidental. It was the result of specific historical circumstances that conspired to push this disaster out of public consciousness almost as soon as it happened. The primary factor was timing. The Empress of Ireland sank on May 29th, 1914. 2 months later, on July 28th, 1914, World War I began. Within weeks of the disaster, the attention of the entire Western world had shifted to the massive continental war that was consuming Europe. Newspapers that had been covering the Empress disaster and its aftermath suddenly had much bigger stories to report. The sinking of one passenger ship, however tragic, paled in comparison to the daily reports of thousands of soldiers dying in the trenches of France and Belgium. The war didn't just displace the Empress from current news coverage, it also disrupted the normal process by which disasters become embedded in cultural memory. In the years following the Titanic sinking, there had been books, memorial services, monuments, and ongoing public discussion that kept the disaster alive in public consciousness. The Empress of Ireland might have received similar treatment under normal circumstances, but the outbreak of war meant that there was no mental or emotional space for processing a maritime disaster that had already happened. The world had moved on to more immediate horrors. Geographic factors also played a role in the forgetting. The Titanic was a British ship that sank in the North Atlantic while traveling from Britain to the United States. It was therefore a disaster that resonated deeply in two of the most culturally influential countries in the Western world. The Empress of Ireland was a Canadian ship that sank in Canadian waters while traveling between Canada and Britain. Canada in 1914 was still a relatively small country in terms of global cultural influence, and the disaster simply did not resonate in the same way internationally. For Canadians, the loss was profound, but Canada's voice in shaping international cultural memory was limited. There's also the uncomfortable reality that the Empress of Ireland disaster simply wasn't as compelling a story as the Titanic from a narrative perspective. The Titanic sinking lasted for hours, giving it a dramatic arc with heroes and villains, famous last words, the band playing as the ship went down, and the clear class distinctions that made it a story about society as well as a shipwreck. The Empress went down in 14 minutes in the middle of the night. There was no time for the kind of dramatic human moments that make for memorable storytelling. It was simply a fast, brutal catastrophe with no redemptive elements. The nature of the collision also made the Empress story less appealing from a narrative standpoint. The Titanic struck an iceberg, which is dramatic and symbolic. The ship was destroyed by nature, by human overconfidence in the face of natural forces. There's poetry in that. The Empress of Ireland was struck by another ship in the fog. It was a mundane navigational accident, the kind of thing that happens with unfortunate regularity in crowded shipping. Lanes. There was no clear villain, no obvious moment of hubris being punished, no dramatic symbolism to hang the story on. Finally, there's the matter of how maritime disasters were understood and processed in the early 20th century. Modern readers sometimes struggle to grasp just how common shipwrecks were in this era. Hundreds of ships sank every year. Thousands of people died in maritime accidents annually. The Titanic became famous partly because of its size and the prominence of some victims, but also partly because it was one of the first disasters where wireless communication allowed for real-time reporting. But even the Titanic's fame was not guaranteed. It took specific cultural work, specific books and memorials and retellings, to keep that disaster in public memory. The Empress of Ireland never received that cultural work. There were no major books written about it for decades. There were no blockbuster movies. The survivors and families of victims held their own memorial services and mourned their own losses, but there was no national or international outpouring of grief that might have cemented the disaster in broader cultural memory. The Empress of Ireland simply sank, killed over 1,000 people, generated a brief flurry of news coverage and legal proceedings, and then faded into obscurity while the world's attention turned to larger catastrophes. Today, the Empress of Ireland rests in 130 feet of water in the St. Lawrence River. The wreck site is protected, but it has been visited by divers over the decades, and many artifacts have been recovered and placed in museums. The ship herself is deteriorating, slowly collapsing in on itself as the river and time take their toll. In a few more decades, the physical structure of the Empress will likely be gone entirely, reduced to a debris field on the river bottom. There are memorials to the disaster in Canada. The city of Rimouski has a museum dedicated to the Empress of Ireland, displaying recovered artifacts and telling the stories of those who died. There are memorial plaques and monuments at several locations along the St. Lawrence. The Salvation Army has never forgotten the loss of so many of their members, and they hold periodic memorial services. But for the broader public, both in Canada and internationally, the Empress of Ireland remains what it has been for over a century now: a forgotten tragedy, a disaster that killed over 1,000 people and then slipped out of history, remembered only by those with a specific interest in maritime disasters or Canadian history. The story of the Empress of Ireland raises uncomfortable questions about how we choose what to remember and what to forget. Why do some disasters become permanent fixtures in cultural memory while others, sometimes with higher death tolls or more significant historical impacts, fade into obscurity? Is it simply a matter of timing? Or are there deeper factors at work? Do we remember the stories that fit certain narrative patterns and forget those that don't? And what does it say about us as a society that a disaster killing over 1,000 people can be almost entirely forgotten within a generation? These are questions without easy answers. What we can say is that the forgetting of the Empress of Ireland was not inevitable. It was the result of specific historical circumstances, of choices made and not made about how to memorialize and process this tragedy. In another timeline, under different circumstances, the Empress of Ireland might be as famous as the Titanic. Children might learn about it in school. There might be major films and books keeping the story alive. The names of the victims might be widely known rather than recorded only in archives and memorial books. But that's not the timeline we live in. In our timeline, the Empress of Ireland is a footnote, a piece of maritime trivia, a disaster that most people have never heard of despite its massive death toll. The victims deserve better. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not just by specialists and enthusiasts, but by the broader culture. They deserve to be more than a forgotten statistic in the long history of maritime disasters. 1,012 people died on May 29th, 1914, when the Empress of Ireland sank in the St. Lawrence River. They died in terror and darkness, many of them trapped below decks as the cold water rose, others freezing to death in the river, all of them victims of a catastrophe that happened too fast for anyone to prevent. Their deaths were mourned by families and communities. Their loss was investigated and litigated. And then, for the most part, they were forgotten. Perhaps by telling their story again, by bringing the Empress of Ireland back into cultural awareness, we can do a small service to their memory. We can't change what happened to them. We can't bring them back or ease the suffering they experienced in those final minutes. But we can remember. We can ensure that their deaths are not completely erased from history. We can make sure that when people talk about the worst maritime disasters, about the tragedies of the sea, the Empress of Ireland is mentioned alongside the Titanic and the Lusitania. We can give the victims of this forgotten disaster the dignity of being remembered. That's what we owe them. That's the least we can do for the 1,012 souls who went down with the Empress of Ireland on a dark spring morning over a century ago. Remember them. Remember what happened. And remember that even the largest tragedies can be forgotten if we don't make the conscious choice to keep them alive in cultural memory. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe with the bell icon to stay updated with our latest stories.